Welcome to Campfire Horror Tales. Tonight, gather close, because what you're about to hear are real cemetery true horror stories, shared by people who experience things no one should ever face alone. Late autumn cemeteries hold a different kind of silence, the kind that listens, watches, and follows. These accounts come from night guards, locals, and families who lived through unsettling encounters among the graves. If you think you know what happens after dark in a cemetery, these real cemetery horror stories may make you think again. I never imagined I'd end up working night security at a cemetery, especially not in late November when the air feels thin enough to break. Hollow Briar Cemetery sat at the edge of town, like a place time had stepped around by accident. The headstones leaned, the wiring buzzed, and the fog loved that place more than the living ever did, but I needed extra money, and the job seemed simple enough. Walk the grounds every hour, check the gates, note anything unusual. They said unusual meant stray animals or teenagers sneaking in. Nobody warned me about the other things. My first 2 nights were quiet. Just the crunch of wet leaves under my boots and the sound of branches scraping the old iron fence. The cemetery looked heavier in autumn, as if the earth was too tired to hold everything buried beneath it. But for the most part, it felt empty in a peaceful way. On the 3rd night, that changed. I was making my usual round past Section B when I heard it, someone whispering. It wasn't loud, more like a breath sliding along the back of my neck. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the wind doesn't say your name. It came so softly I thought I imagined it. But it was clear. Turn around. I spun around so fast my flashlight nearly slipped out of my hand. Nothing. Just rows of stones disappearing into the fog. I told myself it was stress. Or maybe a trick of acoustics. Cemeteries are full of odd echoes. But the whisper followed me for the rest of the shift. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes far away, but always the same tone, quiet, careful, almost pleading. When my shift ended at 4 a.m., I walked out fast enough to make my lungs ache. On the 5th night, the whispering didn't wait for me to settle in. It started the moment I walked under the archway. Turn around. I tried ignoring it, but my flashlight flickered as if the batteries drained at once. That was new. As I tapped it back to life, I heard another sound. Heavy dragging, like someone pulling something through wet grass. It came from the northern fence line. I followed the noise, telling myself it could be an injured deer. But when I reached the area, the dragging stopped. The grass, however, was bent in a wide path, as if something had been pulled across it moments earlier. The trail went straight toward Section D, the oldest part of the cemetery. I'd never liked Section D. Families often left candles there, and even when they burned out, the shadows seemed to stay behind. It was the kind of place where silence feels too intentional. Still, the trail went right into it, and the job was the job. My boots sank into soft ground as I followed the drag marks. They led to a small headstone belonging to a teenager who had passed away last year. Someone, or something, had scratched thin lines across the stone. They weren't random. They were deliberate, perfectly parallel, carved deep enough to catch water even in the dim light. As I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface, a voice whispered directly behind me, "Don't let it in." This time I didn't mistake it for wind. The words were too clear, too sharp. I swung around, flashlight beams sweeping through the fog. Nothing, but something changed in the air. It grew colder, heavy, as if the ground beneath my feet was inhaling. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, each step spaced too far apart to be human. The footsteps circled me, but no shape formed in the fog. I kept the light moving, heart slamming against my ribs, until the beam finally caught something tall between two markers. It stood motionless, as if carved from the night itself. Long limbs, too long, shoulders sloped in a way no person could manage. Its head hung low, angled as though listening to something underground when my light hit it. The figure didn't move, but the fog around it did, pulling inward like a breath. My flashlight flickered again. When it surged back to full power for a split second, the figure was closer. Not by walking, just closer, as though the dark itself had carried it. I ran. I didn't care about protocol, or the job, or anything except the gatehouse. The footsteps followed behind me, faster than mine, but never quite catching up. They stopped the moment I reached the iron gate. The air warmed slightly, and the fog loosened its grip. I turned around once, just once. Section D was still. Nothing moved. But on the headstone with the scratch marks, a faint glow pulsed from the grooves, as if something inside the stone itself was breathing. I quit the next morning. The groundskeeper didn't argue. He just nodded like he'd been expecting it and said softly, "If the cemetery ever calls your name again, don't look back." Some nights, when the wind hits the right angle, I swear I still hear it. Quiet, desperate, almost inside my ear. Turn around. My grandmother wasn't the type to exaggerate. She grew up in a small town where everyone worked hard, winters were long, and stories weren't told for fun. They were told because someone needed to remember something important. The one story she repeated every autumn was the reason Maple Hill Cemetery locked its gates before sunset. She told it to me when I was 10, sitting at her kitchen table while wind rattled the last dry leaves against the windows. "You think a cemetery is quiet at night," she said. "But that's only because you've never heard the wrong kind of silence." She was 16 when it happened. She and her best friend Claire used to dare each other to do reckless things. Nothing dangerous, just the usual teenage nonsense. But one November evening, after school let out early, Claire convinced her to sneak into Maple Hill Cemetery before dark. The place was old, older than the town itself, and most people avoided it. The trees bent low, the stones leaned at strange angles, and the ground stayed cold long after summer ended. They climbed the fence easily enough. Fog clung to the grass in thin layers, rolling like waves whenever the wind moved. The girls joked at first, pretending to read names in spooky voices, tapping on stone angels, laughing too loudly just to break the tension. But as the sky dimmed, the light shifted into that deep blue that comes right before true night, and everything around them seemed to hold its breath. Claire spotted one of the oldest crypts near the center and dared Grandma to knock on the door. Grandma refused, so Claire did it herself. 3 sharp taps, knuckles on cold stone. The sound echoed down into the ground instead of outward, as if the earth swallowed it whole. They were about to leave when Grandma heard something, soft crying, rising through the soil like water moving through pipes. Claire froze. They both listened. The crying grew louder, not like a person sobbing, but like someone trying not to. Wet, shaky breaths pushed through stone and dirt. Impossible and far too close, Grandma whispered that they should go. But Claire shook her head, staring at the crypt. "There's someone in there," Claire said. Before Grandma could argue, the crying stopped. What came next wasn't crying at all. 3 knocks. Slow, heavy, perfectly matching the pattern Claire had tapped just minutes earlier. The sound came from inside the crypt. Grandma grabbed Claire's sleeve, but Claire wouldn't move. Something scraped against the inside of the stone. Long, dragging strokes like fingernails or something harder trying to carve its way out. Then a voice whispered through the door, muffled but clear. "Cold. I'm cold." That broke Claire. They both ran, sprinting through the fog toward the gate. But when they reached it, the gate that had been slightly ajar when they entered slammed shut in their faces with a metallic clang. No one was there to close it. The air was still. Claire shook the bars, yelling for help. Grandma turned back toward the crypt. She shouldn't have. She tells me this every time. She shouldn't have looked. A tall figure stood beside the crypt now, not emerging from it, just standing there. Its posture was wrong, too bent, like every joint had been set at uncomfortable angles. Its arms were long, hanging nearly to the ground. The fog dipped around its feet, pulled downward unnaturally as if something was drawing it in. The figure tilted its head toward them, and though Grandma couldn't see its face, she felt its attention like heat on her skin. It raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and tapped a nearby headstone 3 times. The same pattern, the same rhythm. The gate clicked open behind them, as if unlocking on command. The girls didn't wait. They bolted out and ran all the way home without stopping to speak or breathe or look back. They told no one the full story for years. The next morning, news spread through town that deep scratches had been found on the crypt door. Fresh ones, long and straight, carved by something that knew exactly where to apply pressure. After that night, the cemetery started locking the gates at sunset. No exceptions. Grandma never returned after dark again. She ended the story the same way every time. If something in a cemetery calls out to you, no matter how human it sounds, do not answer. It's never someone who needs help. I believed her when I was a kid. I still believe her now, especially every late autumn when cold wind slips between gravestones and the shadows stretch just a little too far. I used to take a shortcut home through Cold Pine Cemetery. I know how that sounds. Nobody should treat a cemetery like a walking path. But it saved me nearly 20 minutes. And after working late shifts at the diner, that felt like winning time back from the universe. Besides, the cemetery wasn't huge. Just a few acres of old stones and tall pines leaning over them like watchful giants. In daylight, it was peaceful. At night, well, at night you didn't look too closely at anything. The first time I saw the lantern, it was early November. Fog covered everything in a thick blanket, and the moon barely made a dent in it. I walked the familiar narrow path between stones when I noticed a faint glow deeper in the cemetery. Not bright enough to be a flashlight, but steady like a real flame. A warm, soft light, gently swaying. At first I thought it was the groundskeeper. But the groundskeeper never worked nights, and the light came from an area nobody had cared for in years. Still, curiosity won. I stopped and watched. The lantern swung rhythmically, side to side, as if carried by someone walking deliberately between the graves. I couldn't see the figure, just the light. It floated at the height of a chest or head, gliding smoothly, without the bounce that comes with footsteps. It moved from pine to pine, passing through thicker fog patches without dimming. I felt watched in a way that made my shoulders tense. I hurried home, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the fog or someone cutting through like me. The second time I saw it, it was closer. I had just entered the main path when the lantern flickered into view between two tall stones. This time, I could almost make out a shape behind it, a long shadow attached to something standing perfectly still. The lantern moved, but the shadow didn't. It took me a few seconds to realize the lantern wasn't being held. It was floating. I stood frozen, breath fogging in front of me. The lantern glided slowly toward the path, paused, then turned and drifted deeper into the cemetery, almost like it was waiting for me to follow. I didn't. For the next week, I avoided the shortcut entirely. I took the long way home, even when it rained. But one night, after a double shift, exhaustion swallowed my caution. I convinced myself I had overreacted. Cemeteries make the mind see patterns where none exist. So I cut through again. Halfway through, I saw the lantern. Only this time it wasn't distant. It was right in front of me, hovering at eye level. No shadow behind it, no figure holding it, just the lantern. An old-fashioned oil lamp with a glass case fogged from the inside. The flame burned without flickering. Too steady for the windless night. Instinct told me to step back, but every muscle felt glued in place. The lantern rotated slightly, like something invisible was turning to face me. Then I heard footsteps, but not mine. Slow, heavy, approaching from behind. I whipped around. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming, closer, matching the rhythm of someone walking directly toward me. I felt pressure in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. When I turned back to the lantern, it had moved. Closer now, only a few feet from my face. Its warm glow washed over the stones beside me, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Symbols etched into the nearest marker thin. Looping shapes scratched into the stone, fresh and shining faintly in the lantern light. The footsteps circled me. I couldn't see who or what made them, but the sound dug under my skin. Then the lantern suddenly dimmed, as if something unseen exhaled inside it. Go home. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere. Soft, low, almost tired. It wasn't threatening. It was warning. I didn't listen twice. I sprinted so hard my lungs burned, stumbling over roots and nearly falling more than once. The footsteps chased me all the way to the fence, but the lantern glow stayed behind, flickering gently like it was watching me leave. For 2 days I stayed away. But on the third night, I made the mistake of crossing the street near the cemetery and glanced inside. The lantern was there, far back near the line of old pines, burning steadily. It faced the path I used to walk, waiting. That night, I packed up my things and moved in with my sister across town. It was sudden and messy, but I didn't care. I refused to ever walk near Cold Pine Cemetery again. Still, sometimes when fog rolls in across the fields and the wind quiets down, I see a soft glow flickering between the trees in the distance. A lantern swaying gently, searching for someone who used to walk the same path every night. Someone who almost followed it. Someone it's not finished with. My uncle isn't the kind of man who scares easily. He worked in the film industry for most of his life. Small projects, indie documentaries, nature recordings. He camped in forests alone, filmed storms up close, and once spent a week in an abandoned mining town. But whenever someone mentioned Gravenmoor Cemetery, even casually, he would go quiet, not angry, not dramatic, just silent in a way that didn't feel normal. When I was 19, I finally asked him why. He didn't tell me right away. But later that night, after everyone else had gone to sleep and rain was tapping against the windows, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I filmed at Gravenmoor once, only once, and it should have been enough for the rest of my life." He was in his late 20s at the time, hired by a small team of researchers who were creating a documentary about forgotten burial rituals in the Appalachian region. Gravenmoor Cemetery had been chosen because it was old, pre-Civil War old. Most of the stones had sunken into the earth at strange angles, and the surviving records mentioned unmarked graves that weren't supposed to exist. It was the perfect eerie setting for their documentary. His team arrived in late October, just after sunset, to get atmospheric shots. They set up lanterns, cameras, tripods, and audio recorders. The cemetery was silent, but not peaceful. The wind didn't move the trees. The leaves didn't rustle. Even the air felt too still, as if the whole place was listening. My uncle said the first odd thing happened when he checked one of the cameras. It was pointed at a row of headstones along the back fence, perfectly framed. He walked away for maybe a minute, then glanced back, and the camera had shifted, not knocked over, not bumped, just angled slightly toward the woods, as if someone had carefully adjusted it. He blamed it on uneven ground and kept working. The second camera shifted too, then the third. He asked his teammates if any of them had touched the equipment. They all said no. That's when the lead researcher joked that the stones were probably trying to get a better angle. No one laughed. Around midnight, fog rolled in. Not drifting fog, but thick, heavy bands that crawled along the ground like something alive. The lantern light dimmed inside it, turning everything into silhouettes. They aimed a camera toward one of the oldest crypts, just to capture the atmosphere. But the shot came back wrong. On the monitor, a tall figure stood beside the crypt. It wasn't in the lantern light. It wasn't in the fog. It wasn't anywhere my uncle could see with his eyes, but the camera saw it. A long shadow leaning forward, as if listening for something under the ground. My uncle froze. The researcher checked the feed twice, then pointed his own flashlight at the crypt. Nothing there. But on camera, the figure remained. He switched to another camera. The same figure appeared, closer this time. Fog curled around the lens like fingers. They should have packed up then. But the researcher insisted it was interference, maybe a smudge, maybe pareidolia. So they kept filming. My uncle was adjusting a microphone near a cluster of old stones when he heard tapping, soft at first, then louder coming from underground. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more knocks. The pattern repeated, perfectly spaced. He called the others over. They heard it too. Not an echo, not an animal. Deliberate knocking rising through the earth. They backed away slowly, unsure whether to run or investigate. Before they made a decision, every lantern dimmed at once. Except one. A lone lantern near the crypt flared brighter, casting a long shadow behind it, a shadow without a body to cast it. The shape stretched across the grass, growing longer, reaching toward them. The fog around the crypt sank downward, as if something inside was pulling it in. Then every camera shifted on its own. All at once. Their tripods scraped against the stones as if yanked by invisible hands. The lenses tilted, turning toward the unmarked section of the cemetery, an area none of them had approached. My uncle said the air changed there. The ground looked wrong, as if something beneath it was pushing upward, breathing. That was enough. The team finally decided to leave. But one of the researchers stayed behind, still convinced it was all just atmospheric distortion. He kept filming as they retreated. My uncle remembers yelling for him to hurry, but the fog swallowed the man whole, leaving only the glow of his lantern. The tapping beneath the ground grew louder, faster, almost urgent. Then it stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. The lantern fell sideways. They found the researcher just outside the cemetery gate. He didn't remember walking there. He didn't remember falling. He just kept whispering, "Don't go back in, don't go back in." My uncle never returned. He refused to even drive past Gravenmoor again. Every piece of footage from that night was corrupted. Static, warped shapes, shots turning black without warning. Only the audio remained. And in that audio, beneath the wind and footsteps and distant camera clicks, something knocks. 3 slow taps. A pause. 3 more. When he finished telling me the story, my uncle said quietly, "Some places don't want to be recorded. Gravenmoor was one of them, and whatever lives under it, it doesn't like being watched." I wasn't planning to visit Red Willow Cemetery that night. I only went because the first real cold spell of November rolled in, and I felt guilty for not checking on my friend's grave sooner. He passed away last year, and ever since then, I always brought something small when I visited. Flowers, a ribbon, a note. That evening, I picked up a handful of red maple leaves and decided to leave them for him, thinking he'd appreciate the color. Red Willow Cemetery sits on a hill behind a line of old houses, the kind with sagging porches and wind chimes that never sound cheerful. The cemetery gets its name from the willow trees near the far edge. Tall, thin, and always moving, even when the air is still. By the time I reached the gate, dusk had swallowed the sky, and the last bit of sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving everything washed in that pale blue that almost feels unreal. I wasn't scared. I'd walked through that cemetery dozens of times. But that night, something felt heavier. The air was colder than it should have been. And the silence didn't feel like silence at all, more like the moment before a song starts. My friend's grave was near the center, beneath a large oak that dropped leaves faster than anyone could rake them. A thick layer covered the grass, crisp and dry. I knelt down and brushed some aside, then set the red maple leaves gently on top. That's when I heard it. A soft humming, faint, low, coming from somewhere beneath the leaves. I froze. The sound didn't make sense. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was melodic, slow, almost like someone humming a lullaby through a closed door, a warm, old tune that didn't belong in a cold cemetery. I knelt perfectly still, breath caught in my throat, listening. The humming wasn't coming from nearby headstones. It wasn't drifting from the trees or the road or the houses. It was coming from directly under the leaves at my knees. I brushed more leaves aside, expecting to see something. Maybe a hidden vent, maybe an animal burrow, anything that made sense. But the ground beneath was solid earth, undisturbed. The humming grew a little louder, as if responding to my touch. I backed away slowly, heart pounding so hard I could hear its rhythm in my ears. The humming shifted into a softer sound, like someone trying to form words, but trapped behind layers of soil. The voice rose and fell, moving in slow circles, traveling beneath the ground as if something was gliding under the surface. My instinct told me to leave, but grief kept me rooted. What if it was just my mind playing tricks? What if the moment I ran, I'd regret it forever for not understanding what I'd heard? Then the leaves around the oak began to move. Not blowing, not scattering, moving deliberately, curling outward in slow spirals as if something beneath the ground was tracing shapes through them. The pattern tightened, forming a ring around the base of the oak. Inside the ring, the soil shifted subtly upward. A small crack opened in the ground, splitting the soil like a thin smile. A pale light seeped through the crack, dim, bluish, flickering like the glow from a dying candle. The humming paused. Then a whisper floated out, soft as breath. I remember you. I stumbled back so fast, I nearly tripped over a headstone. Cold spread across my chest, sinking deeper with each heartbeat. The whisper didn't sound hostile, it sounded lonely. Familiar, almost like my friend's voice. Only thinner, stretched, as if carried through too much distance. I miss it. The voice whispered, drifting upward. Above. My legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, watching the pale glow pulse gently beneath the crack. The ground trembled, not violently, just enough to unsettle the leaves in the ring. Then the whisper changed tone. Not angry, not pleading, just searching. "Where are you?" My breath hitched. The crack widened a fraction, and I heard movement beneath, soft scraping like fingers brushing against packed soil. My instincts finally kicked in. I turned and sprinted toward the gate, stumbling between stones, my vision blurring from cold and fear. The humming followed me. Not from behind, beneath, traveling under the ground, matching my pace. Every few seconds, I heard another whisper rising through the soil, asking the same question in a voice that didn't belong in the world above. "Where are you?" By the time I reached the gate, the humming slowed, then faded entirely. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut as if it could protect me from whatever moved beneath that cemetery. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. The following morning, I told myself I had to make sure I hadn't imagined everything. I returned to Red Willow in broad daylight. The leaves under the oak were scattered naturally, no spirals, no ring. The ground looked untouched. But the crack was still there. Thin, dark, running across the soil in a perfectly straight line. And at the very bottom, barely visible unless you crouched close, the faintest bluish glow pulsed slowly, as if breathing. My father isn't the dramatic type. He's quiet, practical, the kind of man who fixes things without complaining and never tells a story unless it matters. That's why the one thing he warned me about when I was a kid has stayed with me for years. He told me never to step near the far edge of Miller Oak Cemetery. The section with no names, no dates, nothing but plain stone markers lined up in a crooked row. I asked him why, assuming it was some boring adult answer about respect or safety. But he looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen in him before and said, "Because those graves aren't empty. And they aren't taken either." I didn't understand what that meant until he finally told me the truth when I was 17, the night before I got my driver's license. We were sitting on the porch, late autumn air drifting in with that sharp cold that comes before real winter. He sighed, rubbed his hands together, and said, "You're old enough now." When my father was 19, he worked part-time for the caretaker at Miller Oak Cemetery. His job was simple: clean pathways, clear leaves, help with maintenance. But one season, early November, the caretaker asked him to help prepare a new section of the cemetery that had been left untouched for decades. The row of unmarked stones. My father didn't think much of it. The caretaker was old and moved slowly, so Dad took the shovel and started loosening the soil around the first marker, planning to level it and remove dead roots. But as he dug, he heard something strange. Gentle tapping from inside the earth. Light. Rhythmic. Too steady to be an animal. He stopped. The tapping stopped. He dug again. The tapping returned. 3 slow knocks, then silence. His breath went cold, even though he was sweating from the work. He called the caretaker over. The old man's face drained of color. He didn't tell my father to stop working. He didn't tell him it was normal. He simply said, "Put the soil back." My father did, confused but obedient. As they walked away, my father swore he heard the tapping again, this time from the marker right next to it. That night, the caretaker finally explained. The unmarked row was old. Older than the town records, older than the first chapel that once stood near the cemetery. No written history mentioned who was buried there, if anyone was buried at all. But locals avoided it for generations. The ground was always colder, the grass always patchier, and animals never went near it. They're not resting, the caretaker told him quietly. They're waiting. Waiting for what? He never said. My father thought the old man was just superstitious until something happened later that month. It was a foggy evening near the end of his shift. He was clearing leaves near the northern gate when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Someone walking where no one should have been. At first he thought it was the caretaker, but the silhouette was wrong. It was too tall, shape elongated by the fog, its posture stiff like something trying to imitate how a person moves. It walked slowly across the cemetery, heading straight for the unmarked row. Dad called out, thinking maybe it was a visitor who lost their way. The figure didn't react. It didn't slow down. It reached the first unmarked stone and stopped dead still, shoulders rising slightly, as if inhaling. Then it knelt down. My father froze. Something about the motion felt unnatural, like joints bending the wrong way. The fog thinned just enough for Dad to see its face. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth. Nothing. Just a smooth, pale shape. Slightly tilted toward the ground, as though listening. The earth below the stone shifted subtly, rising, sinking, rising again. Almost like something beneath the surface was responding to the faceless figure. Dad backed away, step by step, barely breathing. The figure placed its hand, long fingers, too long, on top of the stone. The ground trembled faintly, then the tapping returned. 3 slow knocks. A pause. 3 more. My father ran. He didn't stop until he reached the caretaker's shed. He tried to explain, but the caretaker didn't ask questions. He simply locked the shed door, pulled my father inside and whispered, "Don't watch the row at night. They notice when you watch." My father quit the job a few weeks later. When he finished telling me the story, the wind shifted through the trees, sending a scatter of brittle leaves across the yard. He looked at me and said, "The stones without names. They're not empty, and whatever is beneath them knows when someone gets too close." I haven't stepped near that section of the cemetery since. And every late autumn, when the fog hangs low over Miller Oak, I catch myself wondering if the faceless figure still visits the unmarked row, listening, waiting, tapping softly beneath the ground for someone to answer it back.